Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and a very special thanks to Mitchell Kaplan and Books and Books for hosting us. I'm Jacki Lyden, and I'm a member of the steering committee for Writers to Democratic Action, which is hosting this today. Writers to Democratic Action was founded 4 years ago to bring literary activism into alignment with democratic principles of inquiry, First Amendment freedoms, and universal equality. We have over 3,000 members in the US and the rest of the world. Now, for our Democracy Book Club, which this is, we meet monthly here online. We've interviewed authors in extremis in, say, Turkey and Ukraine, and here in the US, banned authors, and also, of course, those who chronicle and challenge the growing anti-democratic impulses we see here in the United States. Now, we come to the Middle East, presenting a special, perhaps at this moment, even extraordinary challenge. I myself am a former Middle East correspondent for NPR for over 20 years in and out. I covered the first and second Gulf Wars, Afghanistan, parts of the second Intifada in 2000. I was our first correspondent on the air on 9/11 in New York, from New York. I'm also a memoirist. But I'm moderating this panel today to talk about our anguish present, the crimes against humanity in Gaza and in Israel, the disproportionate civilian death we're seeing in Gaza, and the unrest we're seeing in Israel and here in the United States. As I said, a time of exceptionalism at this moment in history. And our concern with our very distinguished panel here is to see what, if any, roadmaps can lead us out of this nadir of retaliation, which has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Palestinians, including children, and over 1,000 massacred and abducted Israelis. And this, of course, is just since October the 7th of last year. Is there any way that we might offer hope, a way to ease the suffering, which we realize would not end if a ceasefire were declared before we finish this conversation? But in short, how can we parse how we got here, how to get out, which is always harder than in getting into a war and conflict? What can we do even as the pressure grows by the hour? So assisting me to thread history's needle here, if such a thing is possible, are, as I said, our very distinguished guests, all of whom have deep international credentials. Omer Bartov, welcome, was born in Israel, educated at Oxford and in Tel Aviv. He's the Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the History Department at Brown University and a fellow of its Watson Institute. He's the author of numerous books, most recently last year, Genocide, the Holocaust and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis, and Anatomy of a Genocide, the Life and Death of a Town Called Buczacz, which won the National Jewish Book Award. Thank you for being with us, Omer.
Thank you for having me.
LEILA FARSAKH is a Palestinian political economist who was born in Jordan and is a professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She's written extensively on the politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict. She's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Palestine Studies and the author of Rethinking Statehood, Self-Determination, and Decolonization Beyond Partition. LEILA, we're so grateful that you could be with us today. LEILA? I suddenly do not see her. I think she's going to come back to us. So
yeah, she's here.
There she is. All right, LEILA, thank you. You dropped out there for a moment. I just introduced you. I hope you heard it.
Well, I know I didn't. But it's
all right, but you know who you are, so we're going to carry on. Okay, just glad you're here. Thank you. All right. RU Freeman is a Sri Lankan native and American writer, poet, and a longtime activist on behalf of the Palestinian people, long time. She's the author of Bon Courage, Essays on Inheritance, Citizenship, and a Creative Life, which came out last year, and the editor of the anthology Extraordinary Rendition, American Writers on Palestine. She's worked at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, and she writes for the UK Guardian, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, HuffPost, among other publications. RU, we're very, very glad that you could be with us.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. And hopefully we won't have any more internet gremlins. I want to say to those of you who are joining us here today that we are having a couple of issues. And so if you have a question, please put it in the chat, which is to the right of the screen. You should see there's a little question mark in a box, and you can just drop your questions right in there where it says ask a question. Okay, I hope everybody understands that. Omer, if I could please begin with you. You published a paper recently. You're drawing a picture of an Israeli public riven by the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu and his ministers over curtailing the powers of the Israeli Supreme Court, which, as we know, caused enormous pushback in Israel itself. But you said it was decoupled somehow from a public who could not think of that, and at the same time think of a brutal occupation, these are your words, which had been going on historically for many years, despite some hope around the time of the Oslo Accords of 1994. So I think always the question, you said it was a political stalemate, and then an explosion, and then came October 7th. How did that shift public opinion from what we had seen before?
Well, you mean the shift after October 7th?
Yes.
Because there were two major shifts. One was when Netanyahu installed his government in January 2023 and tried this so-called judicial overhaul, which was really a judicial coup. And what myself and several colleagues argued, and we issued a statement in August 2023, 2 months before the Hamas attack, that the elephant in the room was not simply that the Israeli government was trying to limit the powers of the Supreme Court and have more powers, but that it was doing it so as to entrench the occupation and lead to an annexation. And the public that was demonstrating in large numbers largely refused to see that connection. And that was what we call the elephant in the room. Now, the reason that the Israeli public sort of didn't see that was that people largely bought into the argument that Netanyahu had been selling to it for decades, that the occupation could be managed, that Israel could sort of live a normal life and be fine while half of the population under Israeli control did not have democratic rights. And that exploded in everyone's face on October 7th. Now, how has that changed Israeli public opinion? It's not entirely clear. So what we know right now is that most Israelis want to see Netanyahu gone, and most Israelis support the war in Gaza. That it has some similarities with opinion polls among Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, where most Palestinians in recent opinion polls supported the Hamas attack, although they didn't really want to talk about what happened in the attack. So they supported the fact that Hamas could actually challenge the IDF, but most of them say that they would not vote for Hamas if there were elections. And so there is a kind of stalemate right now. And my own view is that this will change only with the removal of these political leaderships that have been deeply discredited and that had led in a direction that has done a huge disservice to their own publics. I would say both Hamas in Gaza and the PA in the West Bank, which was really just doing the business for Israel, and clearly the Israeli government, which is leading Israel and the entire region down a very dark path, with Netanyahu himself, of course, the main resistor to any stop to the war. For him, the war must go on because that's the only way that he believes he can stay in power.
Well, before we finish this entire conversation, I want to think about that and come back to that thought, because when he is in power, as he is in power, it just seems that almost anything is possible, that it's very difficult to talk about resolution. He certainly has not been persuaded by efforts by the US government. And I'm also intrigued by your comment that most Israelis want him out, but that most support the war in Gaza, because that seems, like a dueling principle there.
Well, it does. We don't know. It may change, of course. I mean, public opinion in times of war is pretty fickle. But it is right now because the way that most Israelis see the war in Gaza is, first, they are being constantly fed the kind of media rehashing every night of what happened on October 7th. They're filled with a very deep sense, whether it's, objectively true or not, doesn't really matter, of insecurity and fear, right. And of a desire for revenge. The second thing is that most Israelis don't know and don't want to know, because they could if they wanted to, what Israel has actually done in Gaza. So this is hardly ever shown on the Israeli media. Now, people could go, of course, and look elsewhere, but most people don't do that. And when anything sort of filters into the Israeli media, it comes in the form of enemy propaganda, anti-Semitism. These are arguments by our enemies. Anything to do with arguments about genocide when it comes to Israel, even by legal experts in Israel, is presented as being motivated by anti-Semitism. And so the public is in this sort of defensive mode, I would say, in large part because it is not being offered any alternative. If there were an alternative leadership that could offer a political horizon, I would say to both groups, to Palestinians and to Israelis, but of course Israel is doing all the destruction right now, then I think people's opinions would change. But they're being presented with the stark reality. We have to fight to the finish, no matter what it costs, and the whole world is against us, and we just have to keep doing it. And meanwhile, the Israeli economy is being wrecked, Israeli politics is disintegrating, and there's not only a vast amount of violence, obviously, as we know in Gaza, but also much less were reported in the West Bank on a daily basis, where there's a sort of creeping ethnic cleansing, and I think by now of over 450 people.
Yes. All right. Thank you. I think that does really define what is going on, and it's something that even our audience today might not be entirely aware of. LEILA, let me come to you. You've written that the struggle for statehood has always been core to Palestinian identity ever since the creation of Israel in 1948. Of course, at that time, the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians, when 2/3 of Palestine became Israel. Yet after several wars, by 2019, the state of Palestine was recognized by 137 nation states. You yourself were not a fan of the Oslo Accords because, as many people did, you felt it rather codified Palestinian losses. But others felt, well, this is something, this is some progress. But that hope was largely eroded after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 by a Jewish extremist, and then came Second Intifada of 2000, hardening feelings yet again. But you say that Palestinians didn't feel part of the more recent talks between the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia, which were taking place last year. And then, of course, comes the Hamas-led massacre on the 7th of October, a date calculated for the most trauma and disruption, which, as Omer just suggested, it has definitely caused. That date, 50 years after the Arab-Israeli Yom Kippur War, which cost thousands of lives. So where is this question now, which has been your mission as a political scientist for decades, the notion of Palestinian statehood?
Okay, I think to understand where we are with the Palestinian statehood and all that, we really need to understand what this conflict is about. And I think October 7th brought us back to the essence of the conflict, okay? And the essence of the conflict is, for the Palestinian perspective, is that it's a settler colonial project. Zionism is a national project, but it's also a settler colonial project, and for which the Palestinians paid a very high price, in the sense of seeing their rights being deprived, being expelled from their home. 48 was the major expulsion, as you just explained. And you could look at the Palestinian national movement as a way of trying to understand what does decolonization mean? How do you get back your land? And I think if we were going to do a quick history, okay, it was clear the first 19 years of the conflict until 67, some people thought Israel can be destroyed. I think the 67 war was very clear in making it clear to the whole region and the Palestinians is that Israel is not going anywhere and it is here to stay. So for the Palestinian, the idea of a Palestinian state, which was first introduced in 1971, not in 64 when the PLO was created, was a way to legitimize the Palestinian struggle for self-determination and their existence as a political entity. Because you should not forget that in 67, nobody talked about the Palestinians. The conflict became about Israel and the Arabs. Okay, Israel is about states, and it introduced a formula of land for peace. Israel gives back land, it's recognized by the region, by the states from whom it took land. And it specifically ignored all the UN resolution pertaining to the Palestinians and did not refer to the Palestinians as people. It referred to them just as refugees in need of a humanitarian solution. In other words, it negated the existence of the Palestinian people, negated their rights, And if people remember, Arafat used to say in 1968, we are not a bunch of refugees in need of a humanitarian solution, which doesn't echo something today in Gaza. We are a people with the right to self-determination. So the Zionist project was always determined on negating and destroying Palestinian existence. Okay, Zionism can deal with the Arabs. Israel, you see, the normalization is precisely about that, is about we transcend the Palestinian, we can make peace with the Arab states. Yeah. The major change happened, so the Palestinian proposing the state was a way of saying we want to exist as a, we are a people, we are a nation, we have a right to self-determination. And you could take the between 1974 until 1998 as the Palestinian leadership trying to prepare the Palestinian population that the only way we can have a state is to accept partition, which is what UN Resolution 181, 1947 said. The international consensus on this problem was the only way how you can solve nationalist, Zionist, and Palestinian nationalist claim over Palestine is to divide Palestine into two states. Okay, and by 1988, that's exactly what the PLO did. It recognized Israel, it renounced terrorism, and the aim was to achieve the state. And this leads us to Oslo. But also, as Omer explained very well, it did not really tackle, it was about managing the conflict. But it did bring something very important, which often, I was critical, many people were critical, but I always say Oslo was revolutionary in one aspect, which is very, very important. It was the first time that Zionism recognized the existence of the Palestinian people. This is not minor, because without it, we will not be where we are. But Zionism answer was, okay, we cannot ignore the Palestinians anymore. Let's recognize them. And also Oslo was about managing them, or more precisely about fragmenting them, which is what happened. And, especially since 1993, whether it is in dividing the areas of the West Bank and Gaza into A, B, and C, whether it is by this checkpoint policy, because Oslo did not end the occupation. Oslo was about managing the occupation, and each side tried to pull things to their side to the best of their ability. Now, the second major turning point is when the international community said there needs to be a Palestinian state as a way to end the conflict between Israel and Palestine. That's the famous roadmap in 2000. Mm-hmm. Another major point is like the Balfour Declaration for Zionism. Your superpower of the day, recognizing that the Zionist movement can establish a national home in Palestine. And here we have, in 2003, the international community saying the establishment of a Palestinian state with provisional borders will end the conflict. But basically, we remained always in a partition paradigm. A partition paradigm that Palestinians were willing to give it a try, only to see that they're losing more and more land and living more and more oppression and losing more and more rights. With the culmination of the siege on Gaza for 16 years before October 7, the demonization of Palestinian resistance. So you have the good Arab, the good Palestinian, and the bad Palestinian. Remember Mamdani, good Muslim, bad Muslim? Now we have good Palestinian, bad Palestinian. Good Palestinian is a PA, want to be in peace with Israel, and the bad Palestinian is Hamas and resistance. So to Omar's point is that I think the situation why the Palestinian support of Hamas is because they are supporting resistance. Okay, in the Israeli side, the problem is that, as Omer also said, the Israeli could, for the past 10 years, not see the Palestinians because they had them. Israel got what it wanted. It fragmented the Palestinian. It divided the Palestinian. It put the siege on the Palestinian. October 7th came to smash that, and it did. And it brought us a second Nakba even worse than 48. But as I always say, also in a different juncture. We are now in a juncture that both people know that they exist. But we're still in the same juncture where partition has been tried and failed, okay? And where Israel is not being held accountable by international law, or by any of its obligations. So we are in a crisis, and a major crisis, of course, but the Palestinians, I think it became clear, my argument has always been, the pursuit of a Palestinian state was not in vain, but its role has come to an end. Palestinians thought with a state they could achieve independence. They can have a state on 22% of historic Palestine. It was the price for having historical reconciliation with Israel. The past 30 years has shown that they were not allowed to create the state because Israel moved 500,000 settlers into the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Israel has built at least 99 checkpoints. the West Bank is completely fragmented, and the violence we see now, the emboldenment of the settlements, is very scary. And the Gaza Strip has under siege, and now is being destroyed completely. And its rebuilding is going to take another generation like 48. So so I think Palestinians coming to realization, okay, Palestinian state affirmed our existence, the quest for a Palestinian state, but the Palestinian state can no longer emerge under this reality. And I don't see, we are in a one-state reality. Doesn't mean we are in one-state solution. We are in a one-state reality where there's only one sovereign, Israel, that is sovereign over on the land between the river of the sea, controlling, as Omer said, 7 million Israelis have rights, and 7 million Palestinians are fragmented legally as well and territorially.
Right.
So I'll stop here.
You've painted a stark picture of what you call a reality, and I will point out it's not as if Palestinians can vote for Hamas. There hasn't been an election over, I think it's nearly
2006. No elections.
Okay. And I was going to say over a decade. And also, I am beginning to read about a restlessness with Hamas. And of course, it's not as if Hamas is recognizing Israel. That position of exterminating it hasn't changed. But I do think I'd like to get Ru's reaction to this, because you've campaigned for Palestinian statehood, for Palestinian rights. I'm also wondering, Omer, if the word Palestinian rights gets discussed in the greater Israeli dialogue about what's going on. Ru, could you sort of reflect on what LEILA just told us?
It's very interesting listening to both of you. It's great to meet both of you. I was saying to Jackie when we were putting this together that I'm the non-academic here. So I don't have sort of like the academic speak of the historical facts and figures and all of these things that are set out in a very textbook way. My engagement is very much one that is much more reflective of the people who are protesting in the streets right now and the movements of people who are speaking up for Palestinians. One thing I did want to know, and I'm really glad that you mentioned Leila's article about the refugee problem and about the non-recognition of Palestine and Palestinians by Israel, because I think the continued non-recognition of Palestine as a state is desirable to the United States. And when you think about the fact that Palestine was recognized finally in 2012 as a sort of a voting presence in the United Nations, but not recognized as an actual state, and just on, I think it was April 18th, I think, that the United States vetoed once more Palestine's effort to be recognized as a state. And the critical reason for that I think people are not paying attention to is that, of course, if Palestine becomes a state, we can have things like a UN peacekeeping force, which can only be between states. And we can have, Palestine at the table. You don't have a bunch of different people outside Palestine discussing the Palestinian problem and how to move the Palestinian people hither and thither. So there is a concentrated effort to make sure that that does not happen. There is a reason for that vote, right? Like there's a reason for all the funding. So for me, I think the concern much more, because obviously all of this history is there. If people want to find out, they can find out. It's not, hidden under a rock. But what is it that we in the United States are doing? What is it that we personally are doing in terms of our place and where we are in our little worlds, wherever that might be? And for me, that is very much, I think, how I look at it is, in terms of anything that I'm doing, is this idea that we are one person wherever we are. So if I'm speaking about Palestine here, I'm speaking about Palestine everywhere. It's not like something I kind of do on the side, and then in certain company I don't mention it, even if it is uncomfortable. You mention it because it's kind of fundamental to who we are. And I think, for me, the very interesting part of all of this is, what are people in the United States doing? Because this is where I am. Yes.
Let me ask you about that, because you wrote as far back as 2012 that President Barack Obama had a historic opportunity that would have made him a one-term president, you admit, if he recognized Palestine at the UN. What about the Biden administration response? Do you see anything changing over the last 6 months. Can you, and we're all going to have to remember to be succinct to some degree for the remainder of our time. What about it?
If you want me to be succinct, I'm waiting for him to lose the election in November, because I think that's going to happen. And I think that is not an undesirable outcome, because for me, I'm looking at these politicians as an internationalist, as someone who thinks of myself as a global citizen, and the impact of what the United States does, and individual people in the United States does, and different demographics in the United States does, and how that might impact outcomes for people all over the world. And I think that there is this sense, and it has happened in every election, as we all know. We are asked, certainly as people, anybody who's registered as a Democrat, for instance, it's okay, it's better than the other one. Vote for this person better than the other one. We've never really had anybody that everybody has actually excited about. If you think about the young people in the United States, there's never been someone that they can get excited about. And then people will say, oh my God, these people, they don't vote. Well, give them someone they want to vote for. And that has to be someone who actually speaks their language and is advocating for the causes they are fighting for. So if you look at all the college campuses and you see all these young people, in their encampments and on the streets and surrounding the New York Times or the various buildings and council meetings, and you're not listening, then there is an outcome that's going to happen come November, and that is not their fault. That is the fault of a generation that is not listening. So for me, the last 6 months, to answer your question, Jacki, succinctly, it has not been a change for the better. It has been a change for the worse under Biden
administration. Well, I will just push back a little to say that most of the political consultants to whom I've spoken, some of who, at least one of whom is on our own steering committee, say that this conflict is not going to be top of mind come November. Now, I don't think anyone sitting here can really predict that. Things are just in the world unpredictable more than ever. But I do think that, we certainly talk about elephants in the room, cannot ignore the massive disruption here at home and the wide displeasure and the pictures that might come out of either the Republican or the Democratic conventions later on this summer. Omer, what about that whole notion, Palestinian rights and the U.S.? I mean, I would think in Israel, there have been all sorts of accolades for President Biden, but yet he's not being listened to. He's having to resort to, the administration is getting, this is becoming the Biden's war, not Ukraine. So just if you could reflect on that, please.
So, let me say first that while I don't think it would be terrible if Biden were not elected president, it would be a catastrophe of universal proportions if Trump became president. And that's probably what would happen if Biden is not. And the repercussions would be around the world. They would not be only for the United States. And it would greatly fortify the kind of extreme right wing that is rising everywhere. And we have to remember, democracies work in such a way that usually at least a third of the people who vote are very unhappy at the result of the vote. The only regimes in which everybody is happy are tyrannies, that everybody thinks this leader is fantastic. We all love this leader, or at least that's what the leader says and the propaganda machine says and so forth. So we have to worry about this kind of hope that everybody would be enthusiastic. Now, as regards Israel, I'm also, I must say, I think about this more pragmatically, because sort of my thinking is that we tend to become quite rightly extremely emotional about what we see. It moves us deeply. We see horror, we see oppression, we see killing of children, destruction of entire cities. And yes, so we respond to it emotionally. But we have to think, how do we come out of this? And to my mind, the sort of choices that we're facing, and that could be the publics in the Middle East could be persuaded to accept, are the following. One would be that there would be one state. in that one state. The way it's working its way at the moment, it would be a state of apartheid. It would be a state where Palestinians would live under various types of oppression and growing oppression. Israel would become increasingly isolated, would become a pariah state, would become poor, would become more violent not only toward Palestinians, but internally among Jews, would be an authoritarian state that could last like that for several decades. South Africa lasted for quite a while. And then at some point would implode, and we don't know what would happen then, as we didn't know exactly before 1994 how all that thing would resolve itself in South Africa. It's not certain that it would be a good story, at least partly a good story as it was in South Africa. That's one option. The other option that the extremists on both sides who want to implement, and Israel is the much more powerful partner, is to get rid of the other population. We are very close to that. And as LEILA was saying, I mean, there's been massive population displacement in Gaza, and if Israel does what it says and attacks in Rafah, this is what may happen. They may in fact succeed in pushing the population out. That would be a vast proportion of Palestinians. That would come under ethnic cleansing and probably would count as genocide. And then to continue doing that in the West Bank. As I say, it would isolate Israel even more, but there are many people in Israel who would like to wake up in the morning and see that happen. And the last thing is to find something else. And that something else is, I think, what most Jewish Israelis and what most Palestinians would like. I think both groups would like two things. They want self-determination, and they want self-determination as a group, as Palestinians and as Jewish Israelis, as Zionists. This is what they want. And the second thing is, what they want is a right of return. Now, Israel has both of those, right? Israel has a law of return, and it has, of course, a kind of self-determination. Although Zionism failed in creating a Jewish majority state, after 1967, it brought back into Israel large numbers of the Palestinians that it pushed out in 1948. Only it never gave them right. Palestinians have neither. And the question is, how do you square this circle? There are various plans for this. I don't know that we have time to go through all the details of them. But this is the crucial thing. We have to understand most of the people living there have not gone anywhere and have no plans to go anywhere. And you have a 50-50 situation. You have 7 million of each living between the Jordan and the sea. And people who speak in sort of vague terms about it being only Israel or being only Palestine don't want to look at the actual people on the ground. They may be thinking that from American campuses, but on the ground, there are living people who are not going anywhere. They have to find a way and to be offered a way to share that space. And I believe that most of them actually do, but they're led by very extremist groups that try to shut that out, to shut out that discussion by violent means. And whenever there is violence, and we saw that in 2000, with the second Intifada, what happened was a rise of strength of Hamas and a rise of the Israeli right. This is what those extremist groups wanted, and that's what they got. And who lost? The people on the ground lost. So somehow we have to think in pragmatic terms. How do you find a way to square the circle for these two groups to? Now, there are people in Israel and in Palestine, there are Palestinians and Jews who are speaking with each other. It's not that there are none. And there are people on the ground, and they tend to be more realistic and less idealistic than people who are outside. That's natural. I'm not saying that it's bad being idealistic, but they have to live there. There are people who are doing that, but they're a minority, and it's very hard for them to move on. They need help from the outside. They need help from the United States and from Europe. Without that help, they will be crushed. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Can I say to that and join, also what Ru said okay. So first of all, we need to be aware that we're not talking about a symmetry between two extreme groups. Okay. We're talking about a structure. Okay. We have a settler colonial structure. So we can all put the blame we want on Netanyahu and on the right wing. But let's not forget the one who expanded settlements is also the Labour Party. So it's okay. You can say the settler movement proved to be much more powerful than the Labour wanted to believe. Okay, but we saw it in 1994. We saw it in 1995. So it's a state policy to have expanded these settlements. Okay, and you know very well that settlements mean the destruction of a Palestinian state. So with Hamas, Hamas has shown, Hamas says, to your point, Jackie, it does not recognize Israel because it doesn't see the point of recognizing Israel. For Hamas said, okay, we have the Palestinian PLO represent everybody, recognize Israel. What happened? The PLO was even willing to surrender completely, and Israel cannot accept Palestinian surrender because Israel wants, the right wing, if you want, to eliminate the Palestinians. So Hamas has said in its charter, in its principle of 2017, that it would be willing to accept a two-state solution, the Palestinian state with Jerusalem its capital, okay, and the famous talk about Hidna, ceasefire, truce, okay. Now, of course, Israel saying, well, you have to recognize me as a Jewish state and all that. These are fig leaves. This is really a question of Zionism have never contended to deal, except with a few people that Omer talked about, which is very important. There are movements within Israel, and there are, especially among the youth, who are aware there's something called Palestinians. But the state policy for the past 30 years has been, whether we like it or not, to dissolve the Palestinian question. And today the strategy failed and Israel doesn't have another one, okay? But on the Palestinian side, okay, the Palestinians have shown flexibility. And right now Hamas is holding the argument is that resistance is the only way. And the answer to it after what happened in Gaza, many Palestinians are saying, is resistance worth the full destruction of Gaza? And of course, many are saying, no, but this is neither here nor there. We are now in this situation of today, of being nearly after 7 months of war that none of us thought would have. I would have never thought Hamas would withstand all this time. And what we're also seeing, let's not forget, that no Arab state wants to take the shepherd. Israel made it very clear already in October. There will be a Nakba, like the Nakba of Gaza will be worse than the Nakba of 48. They're going to be expelled. It tried and always. Egypt is not going to take the Palestinian refugees and Jordan. Whatever it is, we're going to be left with this situation. So I agree with Omer. It needs foreign intervention. It needs the U.S. not to give weapon to Israel. It needs for the U.S. to be strategic. Like for me, what is for me problematic in Biden's policy, I'm too much of a realist, I mean, I see the geopolitics. I agree with many people, like Jackie mentioned, that advisor around him saying, okay, by the time we come to November, Gaza will not be important. We have, Trump is much more dangerous. Okay, and that will be, people will end up voting for us because they're scared of Trump. We'll see. I mean, I know, but from a geostrategic position, the fact that the U.S. voted against this Palestinian state tells you that they're not serious. They're still with the same plan that Israel has while Israel figures out what to do. Mm-hmm. So what you do need, recognize the Palestinian state, again, will be important, but on the ground, because recognizing a Palestinian state is symbolic at this stage. It's recognizing, as Omer said, that Palestinians have collective rights, okay? And just like the Palestinians accepted that Israeli have collective rights. What you read right now is somebody to say, okay, you can square the circle. You can propose a confederate state, okay? You don't move settlers, you don't move Palestinians, you ensure the right of return, you ensure the Jews that wanting to go there, you create a new state, because the challenge is states either adapt or collapse or become more authoritarian. I mean, these are the three options. Authoritarians don't last much if there is not economic viability, okay? Or they don't have oil to fight, to subsidize their population. This is a fact, okay? They can, it can be very destructive. But anyway, I think the challenge we're facing right now in the US, I think it's very important that we're seeing a whole new generation saying this is not in our name. A new generation of American, new generation also of Jewish American who are saying not in our name. And this is something very important, very, very important, because it tells you the Holocaust, the fear of another Holocaust does not justify the Nakba of Gaza. And it doesn't work like that. So I think that is telling us something is shifting. The US administration, unfortunately, under Biden, is still functioning in an old way. It did not get the lessons of October 7th and of this war. Somebody for the pure US interest, if you want to contain Iran, if you want to reduce the power of Iran, you force Israel to stop this war. This is just you're making the situation worse. You're actually giving arm dealers and
you can do it easily.
And you can do it easily. You can do it easily, and they will. I mean, they will, like what happened with Central Kitchen. You know, so there is. I mean, it's just that the Biden administration doesn't want to put pressure because it's scared of the Republican who are going to use it for election purposes. So there are lots of wise voices that are not around Biden, unfortunately, but the fundamental issue. Again, we go back to that. The fundamental issue, which is clear by now, this is an apartheid state. And if Israel wants to be saved, like it happened in South Africa, this is an apartheid state, and apartheid state is not acceptable. Right now, it is so hard because Israel is realizing that this is how it is being portrayed and treated. And it's fighting in all ways on the media level, on every level to shut down this debate, okay, and reclaim the victimhood and so this is why it's a historical moment, and we need to speak truth to power, okay? But we need also people who have leadership and see strategically, not just morally and in a human point of view. I'll stop.
Okay, thank you, Leila, and I'm going to come to you in a second, Ru. I just want to say I haven't seen any questions in the chat box, and I don't know in the Q&A box, which is where questions need to go. And given what we're talking about today and inviting folks in here, I feel really badly. Okay.
Press on the Q&A. Yeah, press on the Q&A.
Press on the Q&A. Okay.
Yeah, that's where it is.
All right. I see one here from Oscald, and I'll get to that in a second. But I do want to invite those with us to please submit questions for our guests. Thank you. Yes, Ru, you wanted to say something a moment ago. Are you muted? Ru? I think you muted.
Leila is muted.
I was muted, and I was just trying to take a quick look at the chat. I didn't see.
I'll take care of that. I'll take care of that.
Okay, all right. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I want to say is all of us can have all our opinions. We don't have Biden's ear unless he's tuning into this or his advisors are tuning into it. So it's not like the 3 or 4 of us are going to, have some, affect some sea change on that policy at this moment. However, we do have kind of authority over certain realms. At Brown, at UMass Boston, within the colleagues at NPR, ex-colleagues, present colleagues, and certainly with WDA. And one of the things, I mean, Jackie, you mentioned the piece about the thing about Biden's war is not going to be Ukraine, it's going to be this one, which has been talked about by certain various conservative people. And I think what is interesting is, why should he have any war, right? And Ukraine, I mean, one of the things for me for instance, our group, this group here, is that we've had on the website, there's this statement of solidarity with Ukraine on the WDA website, but there is no statement of solidarity with Palestine. And that is a problematic thing because, again, I feel like as writers, when all of us are also writers, there is this lack of recognition of the tenor and the charge of the moment and what people are asking for. And as writers, we should be able to articulate that. And when I look at that statement, I'm looking at it's co-signed by the American Association of Ukrainian Studies, the Shenko Scientific Society, the Writers for Democratic Action, and the Association for Women in Slavic Studies. These are not necessarily writers, but there's the Institute of Palestinian Studies that has issued a statement. There's Writers Against the War on Gaza that has issued a statement, the American Association of University Professors, MESA, the Middle Eastern Study Association, the Committee on Academic Freedom. These people have all issued statements that WDA could have co-signed. Why haven't we? And I think that is very critical in when you're talking about things like, why are people not supporting Biden? Why are people? Yeah, they are going to be thinking about it in November. Nobody thought, I think Israel banked on people having fatigue by in a few weeks that they're going to just go back to their business. Well, they haven't. 6 months on, people have only gotten louder. People are in the streets more. Young people are just walking out of school. Schools are shutting down. And this is reflective of what the passion is for the cause of Palestinian people in our small places. And I think that's a challenge for me. I'm saying to the people, because I was invited to speak by WDA, and for me, I'm speaking because I will never not take up an opportunity where I can speak about these things. But it's very uncomfortable for me to be in this group because of the fact that WDA has not made a statement of solidarity, and I'm someone who has spoken out about Ukraine. It is not my cause. It's not the thing I, know to talk about, but it was something wrong, and I spoke about it. So I don't see why there is this difference, and that is one of the biggest charges against Biden.
That he hasn't. That one of the biggest charges
that is, you can say about Ukraine, you can say all these things in the same language is not applied to Palestine, but it's identical scenarios of occupation and incursion and bombing of hospitals and destruction of infrastructure. And there's all this horror and outrage about you can't do this, but he has not been able to say that about Palestine. And that is not something that anybody's making up. It's a fact.
Well, I think my answer to that would be that is exactly why we wanted you here today. We know it's a struggle. I would say that there is, in this particular, whenever it comes to the Middle East, I've been looking at this region for such a long time, you don't always have the weight of a more unified opinion than you would on something like Ukraine, which is affecting, all of Europe. And so that has been true since the beginning, and I think we do have to grapple with it. We do have poems by Palestinian and Israeli poets. We could do more. We could do more. So we're trying to do more here with you.
Why the privileging of the Israeli viewpoint? I mean, even thinking about this discussion, I'm thinking about Omer spoke for a very long time about Israel. And the whole event is about Writers for Democratic Action is presenting this thing from Gaza to Washington. Washington is something we can have an impact on. And we need to have, there should be equal weight giving. And I'm not blaming you, Omer. I've read your work. And I think you do a lot of work to talk about how this is pretty much genocidal practice in, what Israel is doing. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that so long as we continue to do those same things, you're going to have an outcome that is not going to be popular for an entire generation of people who are counting on people showing up and just, ticking the box for blue.
Right.
And
I want to say that I'm a professor at a university, and I deal a lot with young people, which is great. I'm always with young people around. Doesn't matter that I get older. I was yesterday at UPenn and the encampment there. I was on the one at Brown. I teach on this. I've held many events. LEILA was in one of them at Brown. And I think that what young people are doing now on American campuses is exactly what they should do. And what university administrations are doing now is trying to shut them up for reasons that we probably don't have time to talk about. They have to put pressure on the administration. They have to organize. They have to change American policy. All I'm saying is that there is a better likelihood that that policy will see a change with the Democratic administration than with the Trumpist one, because Trump will not give a damn about any of that. So I think that there has to be pressure. There has to be pressure from all parts of American society, because American policy matters in this regard more than any other countries. The United States has the power to change Israeli policy in the interest of Israel itself. Israel's own national interests are being undermined by its own leadership.
I think
the United States can make a good case for it, for actually helping Israel out of the morass that it is in, as well as, of course, doing the right thing in terms of what Israel has been doing to Palestinians, not just now, not since October 7th, but for at least for 57 years of occupation.
I feel like there were people, Israelis stepped out in droves. There were pictures in the New York Times when they were protesting Netanyahu before October 7th, and they were there, and there was this huge, protest. You could see them, lined up there, thousands of people, and people were like, wow, look at this, people are anti-Netanyahu. And my response was, well, clearly, Israelis can come out and protest against something that is affecting them personally, but they apparently can't come out and say, don't build a wall, don't murder our neighbors. So for me, helping Israel is not paramount on my list of priorities on a daily basis. I'm thinking about over 333,000 Palestinians dead. And when 3,000 people are surrounding the White House and saying, don't send arms to Israel, and Biden goes ahead and sends arms to Israel, the idea that somehow Biden is going to, voting for Biden come November, he's going to suddenly have a turn of heart and stop sending arms to Israel, that's not an argument that anybody with a sane brain in their mind is going to listen to. So there are thousands of protesters who are not going to hear that, who don't think that the United States is relevant anymore, because it's obviously not able to do anything to control this, what's happening in Palestine. Instead of allowing the thousands of aid trucks that are blocked up trying to get into northern Gaza, they are saying, we'll build a port so we can bring something else in. Why, for the love of God? There are already trucks, lined up. So Biden could have done that, didn't do it. And in fact, there's a video, evidence of Netanyahu saying, I don't give a flying F about Biden. And when Biden visited during Obama's presidency, you remember, and to say no more settlements, there was the largest,
expropriation of land at that time. Yes.
At the time. And so this idea that people have that somehow come November, people are going to just turn all this off, information off, because people are educating themselves. And
I just want to speak to that, because I think, here's the truth, I don't think we know. I don't think any time when we are in a sense of activism that we really know how a giant electorate is going to perform. If we knew that, things might have, just wouldn't even be here. But I want to step back for a moment, because obviously we're all people of goodwill and good faith and struggling. And I'm reminded of, I was so moved by something that LEILA wrote about her father and his quest, because he was expelled, the family was expelled after 1948, wound up, I think, thank you. You're muted, LEILA. Could you unmute yourself, please?
No, the family could not go in 67. My father
67, thank you. And, I was wondering as I was reading about his profound sense of longing. And here's one thing I will say, Ru. I think it is always vital as storytellers to take a look at the lived experience from the ground of distinct people, distinct faces. And I think that's one of the reasons the World Central Kitchen thing works. And when there's a terrible death, we focus on that instead of such an aggregate. And LEILA, you wrote about how for your father, after that expulsion, really life was never the same, and yet he never gave up hope. Could you just speak to that a little bit?
Well, there's a lot of things I want to speak to too, but my father, what was for him very important is that he refused. He said he was determined to go back. I mean, it was a sense of agency, is that you don't take from me my right to be home, my right to die in my home. It was his mission, is that, because you know what happens, and Omer said it once when I gave the talk, no, in one of his pieces, which I once you leave home, home is never again the same thing. But I think there's a big difference if you leave home by choice or you leave home because you're expelled. And what happened, and that's been the story that I try to understand all my life, that we're going to write, is like about those who return and those who don't. Because when you're exiled, you have two choices. Either you accept the loss and make your life somewhere else, or you're determined to go back. And my father was one of those, the other in the family who said, "Khalas, accept. We're going to go back." There's, the right of return is also becomes like the promised land. We have our promised land as well, Next year in Jerusalem, it's not only the Jews who say it, also the Palestinians. We're going to go back, okay? But my father was determined. He's going to go back and he's going to do it. And that was the dream. I grew up with that, because also our life was transient. I know what exile is. We were not given home. in Beirut or Lebanon or Jordan or Dubai or Kuwait, you name it. You are transient all your life. And because he was born in Palestine, because he saw the refugee, my father was from Birzeit, so in 48, he was 15, and he saw the refugees coming from Lid, because many of the refugees, and they were people who had their jobs and money and wealthy, and he saw them coming. He was 15 years old and camped in a camp on a hill in Birzeit, which became a refugee camp, okay? And he swore then, at 15, in 48, this will never happen again. It happened because our fathers were not aware of the Zionist danger. So imagine the shock he felt in 67 to see he has been active politically, like so many of his generation, because we forget also that the Middle East of the 50s and 60s was full of hope and full of determination. The third worldism, we're going to change things again. And 67 happens. And he was of the character, I'm going to do everything. He's the generation of the PLO. He's the generation of Arafat. He's the generation of saying, we're going to go home. And they go home, and this home becomes a big prison. And not because these people did not pay their dues. These people paid their dues. So this is why I come back to what Ilyas Khoury said it very nicely. A wonderful writer. He said, Israel could not even accept Palestinian surrender. Palestinians surrendered and still oppress. So this goes back to the point of RU, which I think very important, I wasn't aware that the writers for democratic actually not take a position on Palestine. I think the big elephant in the room is racism. Let's say it. We are children of a lesser God. We are not white enough like the Ukrainians. I'm sorry. Ukrainians had made their work through 50 years that they became white. Okay, so and there are geostrategic interests that fits, like this is an easy war to defend, to be against, because it's the Russians, we are against the Russians, it's oppression, In the question of Israel-Palestine, why is it very difficult? I mean, some people tell me it's difficult. I don't think it's difficult. I really think it's very clear. It requires from you clear moral compass. Every other conflict you can fudge. I'm with this, I'm with that, I'm with this, I'm with that, With Israel-Palestine, especially at this juncture, we need moral clarity. Do we believe in the right of people to equality or not? Do we believe that some people have more right to suffer than others, or somebody's suffering is superior to other people's suffering? This is where we are in. And because Europe never solved, and the West never solved the problem of anti-Semitism, and here we bring it back, the question of Ascol. Okay. Anti-Semitism is real and serious, okay? But it's a problem of the West. The Middle East has a different issue. Palestinians' opposition to Israel has never been really anti-Semitic, has been a problem of occupation and negation, okay? And to conflate it all together, to make in the US, and this is where we as writers, as academics and as writers, especially you and I, when you see the New York Times making it that all these demonstration on campus and the administrators want to protect Jewish students. Well, are you aware many of the demonstrators are also Jewish students? Who gets to speak for Jewish students? And I don't want to do it. This is not my job. But this weaponization of anti-Semitism and this weaponization is very difficult to take a stand on Israel-Palestine because no, it's very easy. It's very easy. You're either with human life or not. You're either with the no suffering to anybody or not. You're either with understanding structures of power and not equating the oppressor and the oppressed, or not. You can totally say that the oppressed did massacres. Okay, that totally take them to court, but don't equate two sides with the same thing. This is not right. This is not what we do. This is what writers do, don't we? Writers would try to understand why we are in this condition. What brought us to this? Where's our agency and where's the condition that brought us to this? How far are we really conditioned by our condition, or do we try to do something with it? So I think this is something it's important to say, because also what's happening on campuses and what's happening with Biden. There is a shift, a generational shift happening. This is a historical moment. We either capture it or it will be captured by somebody else. And I believe because I look so much into history to try to cope with the present, because the present is unbearable. I think of 73. You remember 73? Omer, that was a major turning point. Israel managed to turn it to its interest within 5 years. Now the situation is different. This can turn different. It's like Vietnam as well. It could also evaporate. It can vanish. We don't know, because we need to understand the forces for and against. But what we as individuals can do, and we as writers, and we as academics, is speak truth to power, and investigate what is really our moral compass, where our zone of or where we are uneasy about, and how to challenge this unease. Yeah, and that's what I'll stop at this point.
Well, I think excellent points, and I think we are speaking truth to power. And what you were talking about a moment ago is that your father, when he did go back, he managed to go back, but it became his prison because he still couldn't get the papers. And even when he did, he would just be so, he couldn't stay outside the country because he was afraid he'd never get back in. And I thought in some sense it was a paradigm for, what has happened since the beginning of 1948, the constant need for recognition. And this comes from a lot of different people, but it is not an even playing field. And he was willing to basically to die for it. He managed to choose that. A lot of people are not able to choose the reality they're living in just now. There is a real fear of a second Nakba, a huge push if the attack goes forward in Rafah. And as you so well pointed out, Ru, I think, the sense that it shouldn't be hard to have a voice and have a moral compass, and it's why we wanted to have the forum that we had today. And I think allowing and pushing and trying to unite around the sense that we do want, we can't live like this. This is not the outcome that I think any person with heart and morality wants. Certainly isn't what I want to see or our organization see. So we're really grateful. I feel like I'm looking at these questions. I agree with Omer's points. Is Israel suppressing the media? Doesn't much matter who's president in America. Very much appreciate this important discussion. Can it be picked up elsewhere? Speaking as a Ukrainian American, I agree with Ru. That's coming from Oskal. I just didn't want anyone to feel that we weren't hearing them today. So I think that this might be a good place not to conclude, because I wouldn't for one single second like anyone to think that we have concluded this and wrapped this up and are simply moving on. Perhaps we could have a discussion like this every other month or every couple of months. That might be something to do, to see where all these different ideas are going, to see where the protests on the campus have led, to see what happens outside these conventions, to see what happens after, to see if there's any accountability for what you call, Omer, the crimes against humanity. Whether genocide belongs here, doesn't belong here. Certainly crimes against humanity, I think, is something that we can all agree on. Will there be any accountability at The Hague, any price to be paid for what is going on here? When does weariness become, I think, Leila, you said Israel's response has been existential, to just make things so degraded, so wearying that you're numbed. And that is something I don't think any of us wants to be, even when we're struggling with exactly how we should respond and what the right answer could be or how to go forward. So with the sense that we do all want to go forward, I do again want to extend our deepest gratitude from WDA. We're working on some of the things you suggested. I have a feeling here, Ru. And if any of you would like to share a parting thought, we're a bit over the time, but I think we should wrap up for this moment and invite you back.
I just want to say one thing,
yes,
if I can, in agreement with what Leila was saying, and I've been writing for a while now. I mean, this is a very, very tragic moment. It began with the horrific massacre, and it continued with the destruction of an entire region and the killing of tens of thousands of people, mostly civilians, the majority of them children. So it's a horrible moment. And these lives will not come back. But it can also be a moment, an opportunity. But that opportunity has to be seized. And it's an opportunity to change the entire political paradigm, to think about this whole region, specifically Israel and Palestine, differently. That has to happen. If it doesn't happen, then we will accept this grim, deadly logic that is being imposed right now by the Israeli government, and that is largely being condoned by the US and by the Europeans. There has to be a change in the paradigm. It is an opportunity. I think people and everywhere in that region are filled with despair. absolutely filled with despair. I'm in touch more with Jewish Israelis than with Palestinians, although I'm also in touch with Palestinians. People are filled with despair. The people are celebrating are the extremists. They're celebrating. They're actually enjoying this. And we need to change that paradigm. People need to take over power. They have to do it here, and they have to do it in the region here, because this is the only country that matters for the Middle East. No other country matters the way the United States does. That's a fact. We may like it or not, it's a fact. But the reality of life is over there. And I hope that we will be able to do that, and that all of us, everybody who's listening here, people across campuses, just American citizens, Palestinians, Jewish Israelis, will accept that paradigm of just constantly killing each other, oppressing one group by another over decades, can finally change. If we don't believe in that, if we don't have that horizon of hope, we are actually accepting the point of view of the extremists who always seek catastrophe and destruction.
Peace them. All right, thank you. I think leaving the word hope here and agreeing that we need to do so much more and talk some more is a good place for us to stop at this moment. Again, thank you. Thank you, everybody who is watching and being with us today. I hope that you got your questions answered. A little hard to see. On behalf of Writers for Democratic Action and these authors and poets here in front of me, thanks for joining us.